Hello, welcome to 8.9 News. I'm Finlo Costain. Food and agriculture are high on the agenda for COP28, with food systems taking centre stage for the first time. The Sustainable Food Trust says that this provides an historic opportunity to drive progress and that they'll be working hard to make sure that the views of farmers are central. Lesley Mitchell is the policy director at the Sustainable Food Trust. I asked her whether she thinks COP28 can really shift the dial positively on food systems.
I think the thing with COP28 is that it is the first time we have seen recognition from state actors, so governments, but also a body of non-state actors as well through the Higher Level Champions Network, really recognising the role of food and agriculture in the future of climate action. So it's like pressing a button on the start of it. There's been a lot of noise over the last couple of years from food systems pavilions in the fringe and so on, saying that this needs to happen. But actually, this is now filtered through to those actors. And it does place requirements. People are making commitments. Obviously, they're only as good as the action that comes from them. But it is a landmark first. And it comes with all kinds of challenges as well as positives.
Lesley, have you seen anything so far that genuinely makes you think that the sands are shifting in terms of agriculture away from pure driven mitigation towards an understanding that emissions reductions must go hand in hand with adaptation, biodiversity regeneration, and the reversal of desertification, and that without this, we are simply accelerating broader ecological breakdown?
I think it could go one of two or many messy versions of ways forward. So the things that I have seen that I'm quite interested in have not come directly from people talking about food systems necessarily, but talking about resilience and ensuring, for example, that smallholder farmers have greater resilience to climate shocks, looking at funding for loss and damage, that I think now we have an agreement of money that can go to governments and a focus on food and agriculture, that you do have the potential to direct financing, if people are smart, towards adaptation and resilience building for farmers, for example, in the global south and Africa, who are going to bear the brunt of the challenges of the climate situation. So they're not directly about food systems, but what this recognition of food systems is, and it's not yet in any treaty, it's not written into anything, these are just commitments. What it does is it opens the door for that to move forward. The other one that I'm interested in is the Regen 10 initiative, which is really focused on regenerative agriculture. And that has been built in part with Sustainable Food Trust as a major NGO stakeholder and others. And it is a huge body of organisations from WBCSD, OP2B, sorry, these are all acronyms, but basically the places where corporates get together and businesses get together and NGOs get together and philanthropies to look at how to progress regenerative agriculture. And there's also been a big focus on regenerative agriculture financing from philanthropies with a major call to action. So I do see things that are positive, but the devil is going to be in how people take them forward.
I want to come back on that resilience point because I agree that this emphasis on resilience is important and it's a welcome change. But the idea that it's simply focused on the global south is, to me, a concern. The idea that the global south is the area of the world that's going to be most impacted by climate change, I think, is false. Yes, they will be most affected immediately by the weather, but because of the conflicts arising, particularly around food systems and the migration that we're likely to see, there is going to be an enormous impact on the developed world as well, which will also impact on the food systems of the developed world. And so from that perspective, resilience is key across the board. Do you think there is any understanding? Because it strikes me that we're still viewing climate change as something that happens to other people rather than something that's happening here to us in the global north as well as the global south.
I think there's two layers to it. I think one is our own preparedness for these things and what kinds of food systems we are going to need to be resilient, what kinds of farming systems, what we're actually going to be able to grow. And I would just point back to some work that the Sustainable Food Trust did a few years ago, looking at, it's called Feeding Britain, and it looked at if you wanted a resilient, regenerative future for food and agriculture in the UK, what would you need to grow? And it showed a very different picture to some of the things that you hear coming out of something that's carbon tunnel vision, emissions focused. And so it was looking at, yes, we do need to be much more plant forward, but we need to be able to grow and eat the things that we can produce in the UK. It had a big focus on pasture-based farming because of the role of livestock, for example, in rotational grazing, in permanent pasture land where you can't use it for anything else. And that actually that shifted the dial from what you often hear, which is this ban beef, eat chicken. And actually our systems for chicken and pork, I think, are the areas of real volatility because they are so dependent upon massive inputs.
But is this message getting through to the global actors? Is this message getting through to the governments at COP? Because, of course, as you say, that report was fantastic. And there have been, several other reports that have come out since then, showing the same things. And within ourselves, we're having that conversation. But is it starting to get through higher up?
Frankly, I think that's going to, in the UK particularly, that's going to be a big part of 2024, because with carbon tunnel vision, people are just focused on emissions rather than warming impacts, but also rather than what you have mentioned, Finlo, which is that we need to build holistic solutions. And we need to build solutions that deal with biodiversity, deal with farmer resilience, deal with livelihoods, deal with social outcomes, deal with pollution, as well as dealing with carbon. Because at the end of the day, this isn't just about how can we reduce the numbers, which are so important from a carbon perspective, but also do this in a way that actually builds back the resilience and the restoration of nature and so on that we have so heavily depleted. So I think there's one thing for me, which is, yes, this is going to hit us in the global north. It's going to hit us in the global north in our own farming systems and food production systems. It's going to hit us in how heavily we are dependent upon international supply chains and inputs for many of our industrialized products or our very kind of complex supply chains and commodity supply chains. But the third way is going to be exactly what you said at the start of this, Finlo, which is that how we think about those solutions is going to shape the future of farming.
So the Sustainable Food Trust is calling for key commitments from governments and non-state actors. Could you briefly just talk us through them?
Yeah, so this is really looking at how you use the pillars of power and structures and systems that support food and agriculture, and how do you need to rewire them? So I think there are three key areas for that. The first one is, as we've talked about before, metrics. So that sounds really boring. It's about data. But actually, if you don't look at the biodiversity impact alongside the climate impact, alongside the environmental impact or the social impact, you get a warped picture. And so one of the key things the Sustainable Food Trust has been calling for is to build harmonized, holistic metrics that we all use to measure those impacts and be able to make decisions on them, not just from the point of view of farmers themselves, and of course that's the core part of any food supply chain, but from the point of view of corporates and other actors like financiers, which brings us to the second piece, which is financing the transition. Mm-hmm. All of our financial incentives are designed around a 20th century food system. So they're based on yield, they're based on productivity, they're based on short-term return. And we need to be in a situation to support and enable those financial institutions that have the power to rewire the system. So Sustainable Food Trust is involved with the Sustainable Markets Initiative, which was created by the King, who obviously has spoken very firmly at COP28 this week. But the point of that is to bring some of those key banks and companies, corporates, food companies, and so on together to look at how can they use their financial might and mechanisms to rewire that system. So that's the second thing that we're asking for at COP. And then the third is the enabling policy environment. So at the big global level, that is about nationally determined contributions, which is we bandy around these things. It basically means at a government level in our own countries, what do we include within the targets for reducing climate emissions And so we are asking at this point in time for the countries to include food and agriculture in their nationally determined contributions. But
And is there a
inevitably
part of that? Sorry, is there a part of that which is about trying not only to connect food systems into that emissions reduction, but also to understand that an emissions reduction needs to be thought of in a more holistic way?
Exactly. And so I think that the NDCs are the top line, but actually it's what policies do you put in place? Things like your sustainable farming incentives. What do they actually cover? How do you build that into food systems? How do you build that into integrated policy? How do you support regions to be to have more localized food networks, for example, and create their own solutions? Because at the end of the day, food will be a much more localized thing in future. So the devil is in the policies that come behind that. But the start simply says you've now got to think about this. It isn't just about energy or cars. This is now about food and agriculture.
And just finally, what progress do you think is being made in the area of harmonized metrics for agriculture and food systems?
So I think we're actually at a bit of a watershed for that. So the Global Farm Metric, which is an initiative that was created by the Sustainable Food Trust, but has brought in actors across the food system, corporates and farmers and so on. It's a farmer-centered metric that enables farmers to assess where their risks are and what their impacts are. And that has now been going for several years. And there's lots of paddling under the water. People keep saying, well, where are you at with this? And it's showing in two different spaces. One is pilots. So we have a significant number of pilots now in the UK, in the US, in Australia. We're looking at other regions as well, and where we're working with partners on the ground to support them to put it in place. And then the second is Regen 10. So that framework is coming through. And it's also very much reflected in things like the Sustainable Agriculture Initiative platform, which is all the corporates. So I think we're getting to a point where people are recognizing that metrics beyond carbon are important. They are beginning to look at how you create that framework and principles. The thing we've really got to pin down is that remains farmer-centric and isn't a corporate takeover.
That was Lesley Mitchell from the Sustainable Food Trust. More news on our website, 8.9.com. That's all for now. We're back soon. Thanks for watching.